This isn't a story anymore. It's a statement. 13-0. Big Ten champions. Indiana didn't ask for a seat at the table. They took it. Now the lights get brighter. The stage gets bigger. Pasadena. The Rose Bowl. Number 1. Indiana versus number 9, Alabama. Tonight we break down the matchup, revisit the undefeated run that reshaped the program, and look ahead to what comes next, including the 2026 portal plan. This is the Hoosier.com Roundtable. Strap in, because it starts now.
Raiola. And picked up the sideline. Indiana, Asbury, walking them down. Woo! IU, America, they got a football team now.
Hello and welcome to the Hoosier Tailgate here on the Hoosier.com, our special Rose Bowl preview show for the upcoming Rose Bowl featuring number 1 Indiana versus number 9 Alabama. We're going to get to the guys here in a second on our roundtable discussion here, but we appreciate you coming by and joining us here this evening after this historic run by Indiana. 13-0 on the season, Big Ten champions, and all of a sudden now they're thrust to the main spotlight. Fernando Mendoza with a lot of awards, no more important than the Heisman Trophy. Some couple Coach of the Year honors for Coach Cignetti, and some Coordinators of the Year honors for Brian Haynes, who is a Broyles Award finalist as well, Mike Shanahan. So a lot of buffets, shaking hands, kissing babies before they get themselves on par to start their prep for Alabama coming up here in a couple of days. But I want to get to tonight's guest as we bring in the guys from the Hoosier.com, Zach Browning, Colin McMahon, and Drew Rosenberg, our 4 resident experts, you could say, on the subject of Indiana football. Guys, I appreciate you coming by. I know when we last did this, I know we had a roundtable prior to the season starting, and we all kind of sat around and said, what would this record be for this upcoming 2025 season? And I think we all kind of landed on that 10-2 landmark with this ball club and a potential 9-3. When you looked at that time, we talked about a 3-game gauntlet with Illinois and Oregon being one of the 2 of the biggest games in test, and in between that, Iowa. This Indiana team came out with flying colors, and lo and behold, we're sitting here at 13-0, the number 1 ranked team in the country, and a potential opportunity now to win a national championship for Indiana, which would be beyond historical in the terms of that. 1968, I believe, was the last time Indiana was at the Rose Bowl. Now we're here again here in 2025 before actually kicking off 2026 on January 1. Zach, I'm going to come to you first, and we'll kind of take this around the table a little bit. But for you, what made this Indiana team different this season as opposed to maybe last year?
I think you probably have to start at the quarterback position. Nothing against Curtis Rourke, but Fernando Mendoza is a Heisman winner. He's going to be the first quarterback taken this offseason in the 2026 NFL draft. So I think that's probably the biggest difference between last year's roster and just team in general and this year's team. But I also think there is something to be said for having been through it and having gone through the fire like Indiana did last year. You know, last year was a good learning experience. You go on the road and lose to Ohio State. In the college football playoff, you go on the road and you lose to Notre Dame. It is what it is. Indiana didn't have the success last year in the postseason they would have wanted, but it's a learning experience. And I think if you talk to anybody on this roster, and these guys have said this throughout the year, and even as recent as when we've talked to them this past weekend, that last year was such an invaluable learning experience that everybody needed it. Everybody needed to kind of see how things went and kind of see how things kind of worked in the college football playoff. So now they feel better prepared for this year. I think those are the 2 biggest things. Obviously, the quarterback Fernando Mendoza, Curtis Rourke. Curtis Rourke was awesome. He broke Indiana's single season passing record, and Fernando Mendoza came along and broke it and had one of the best seasons in Indiana football history. And then obviously just being able to go through what Indiana did last year. I think those are the two biggest things.
What I was saying there was, along with that story that you talked about there, Zach, is the side stories that go into this, Drew, too, was the number of injuries that Indiana was able to overcome this year. But what was, in your mindset, different this year with this Indiana ball club?
If you're asking me, I think it's the O-line. I think you look at, last year and, the big games is Ohio State, Notre Dame. Indiana really couldn't run the ball, became one-dimensional. And that allows, really good teams like Notre Dame and Ohio State to pin their ears back and get after the passer. And when you have a quarterback like Curtis Rourke, who, was playing on one leg pretty much, not really able to evade and, make plays with his feet, becomes that much more difficult to move the football. Versus this year, numbers won't be as pretty in some of the bigger, 300-yard games, but against Oregon, even Iowa, Ohio State, like Indiana still was able to run the ball like a lot more effectively than they could last year. And they weren't one-dimensional, which, they were able to mix it up a little more. And then Mendoza's ability to run the ball and make plays with his feet is just a whole nother added dimension to the offense. It's made this team a lot more difficult to stop.
Yeah, no question about that. We all thought the offensive line was going to be a huge improvement from a year ago. Coming to you, Colin, kind of the same question in your mindset. What kind of, from your perspective, was different about this year's ball club?
I think Zach and Drew both kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think that Fernando Mendoza adds a different element that last year's team didn't have, not only with his mobility, but we all know that Fernando Mendoza is just a special talent. Obviously, Curtis Rourke was incredible, but Fernando Mendoza is just kind of a different animal, and as proven by his Heisman Trophy win, right? And you throw in the fact that both the offensive and defensive lines were much improved, and you really have two of the biggest areas in football improve: the quarterback and then in the trenches. And you throw in different skill positions where Surratt, Omar Cooper, EJ Williams, and Charlie Becker have really formed a great wide receiver tandem. And you also have great production out of the running backs. And then you also have incredible linebackers, and the secondary really came along in the second half of the season. And really the only kind of setback this team faced early on was allowing those big plays on defense. And they've kind of cleaned that up later on, especially in the Big Ten championship. And so with all those different things coming together, you had a team that was 11-2 improved to a 13-0. And, football's a game of inches, and realistically, none of the categories I just mentioned improved drastically, but with improvement in the inches across the board, you saw that really pay off on the road at Oregon and at Iowa, and then in the neutral site Big Ten championship, where last year away from home, that was where they struggled. This year away from home, they really played well in clutch moments and obviously ended up going undefeated and becoming Big Ten champs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another good defining moment there, too, is some of the guys that stepped forward in this year's team on top of the injuries. When you look at Charlie Becker, who's a guy that's been in the wings waiting for that opportunity, he gets it and really just takes off in terms of what he's been able to do this year for Indiana. Going back to this year, I guess we all look for those, that defining moment for Indiana. Kind of what was the defining moment for you guys in terms of this ball club working its way to 13-0? When I look at it, I think the most defining moment for myself was the fact of that 3-game gauntlet that we all talked about: Illinois, Iowa, at Oregon, and watch Indiana dismantle Illinois at home, go on the road to a very hostile Iowa team whose defense is better than what people give them credit for. I mean, they had a top defense, and Indiana went there to win that ball game on a great play with Surratt catching the slant pass and racing for 50 some odd yards for that go-ahead touchdown. And then, of course, Oregon on the road there. That one, I think, is when the nation started taking total look at Indiana as being a serious contender. So that was my defining moment. what other defining moments may there be for you guys, whether that is the same or different? Drew, we'll go to you first on that one.
Yeah, there's a couple that comes to mind, but the one that really stands out is fourth quarter against Oregon. Mendoza throws the pick six, game's tied, and it's how does this team respond? And it was kind of a question we had coming into that. How would they respond? Punch in the mouth, hostile environment, one of the toughest environments you'll ever play in college football at Autzen. And Mendoza comes down and leads a 75-yard drive to essentially win the game. And it kind of told me a lot about this football team, like the mental toughness they have, specifically Mendoza. How would they respond to make a mistake, punch in the mouth, next play, hostile environment, one of the toughest environments.
Yeah, that is another good point of the defining moment in a road game, on the road, hostile environment. And the question that was posed to him as he came to the sideline, and I've had, my background was coaching quarterbacks, and you've got to find those moments that you can interject. And what Signetti did when he threw that pick and he came to the sideline and they asked him, "Are you having fun yet?" Really, in a lot of ways, I think calmed that whole scenario down that allowed Fernando to come back up as he came to the sideline. And I bet, just another unique point in time. And, Zach, how about you? Is there a defining moment of this season that you can interject and really push the envelope to the point where we're at today?
Yeah, I'm going to get really specific here. I'm going to go to that Iowa game that Iowa went on the road. That was the biggest game for Indiana because it gave Indiana belief to go into Oregon 2 weeks later after the bye week and believe that they could win a game on the road against a tough team like that in Autzen Stadium. But even more specifically, that play late in that second half when Fernando Mendoza scrambles to the far sideline, gets blown up out of bounds, no flag. And there was a kind of dust up. There was a scuff on the sideline. Pat Coogan rallied everybody. It's become lore at this point with what Pat Coogan said to his team and what the teammates said to each other during that kind of little mini break there in that skirmish. But I think that was really the biggest moment of the season for Indiana because it was a rallying cry. You just beat Illinois 63-10. You're on the road against Iowa. If you lose that game, then a lot of what you did against Illinois is pretty much all for naught in that situation because you can't do it on the road. You can't do it against a good team on the road. It would have set the season up to go a very different way. So I think that specific moment of Pat Coogan specifically rallying the troops and getting everybody together and delivering that speech and then going out to finish that game and win that game the rest of the way, I think that's the biggest moment of the year.
Yeah, it's another good point in time that you can pinpoint that moment where things changed maybe in the eyes of the guys that were on the sideline because it's an us against them mentality. And having Coogan a part of this offensive line this year too could be defined as a defining moment because of what he brought from a leadership standpoint to the ball club. Colin, how about you? Do you have a specific defining moment for this ball club for this year?
There's a lot of obvious ones, with Fernando Mendoza. You could go the pass to Omar Cooper in the back of the end zone against Penn State, possibly the best play in college football this season. You could go the game winners to Surratt against Iowa, Oregon, or Ohio State. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction, and I'm going to stay with the Iowa game. After Mendoza threw that interception in the fourth quarter, all Iowa needed to do was get one first down, and the game would have essentially been over. The defense forced a field goal, which ended up being missed, which resulted in the Surratt breakaway to win that ball game. And the defense did similar against Penn State. Penn State needed one first down. If they would have gotten it, Indiana wouldn't have gotten the ball back. And obviously they ended up having a game-winning drive there too. Obviously, the game-winning drives on the offensive end were spectacular, but without the defense making those two stands, they wouldn't have been possible. And if Indiana would have ended up losing those two games, they wouldn't be in the college football playoff today. And so, the offense is fantastic and everything, but I don't think that this defense gets nearly enough credit. And you could point to the Ohio State game as well, late in that third quarter when Ohio State was driving down the field. They ended up stopping them on that 4th and 1, and that was really the difference maker in that game outside of obviously the game-winning touchdown. So, we could talk about Fernando and all that he does in clutch moments, but without the defense, none of it would even be possible.
Great two examples, and I couldn't agree with you more on the standpoint of what this defense has been able to do this year, allowing I guess you call it complementary football to a certain degree, because when these two sides of the ball in sync, Indiana's pretty much unstoppable. I mean, you saw the result of big stops that turned into big drives that led to scores, especially at Penn State. When you talk about the resulting drive Indiana had there in the final minutes, I mean, you're 2nd and 17, and you throw a dart on a four-bender route, four verts with the bender with Coop, and it was a miraculous throw that ended up giving them the first down they needed there. But again, like everyone has pointed out, many different defining moments in this year. And it's ironic to say the game of inches. Indiana's been on the other side of that. We can think about 2 or 3 years ago when Indiana had lost, I don't know how many games, by a total of like 13 points total. And the difference to their year was basically framed by that specific moments in those games. And again, that's been the difference with the Kurt Cignetti era. Indiana has made the plays to give them the opportunities to be where they're at today. And everything that we pointed out there, you could, rank them all equally when you talk about defining moments on the year in that respect. Last question as it pertains to looking back, because we're going to start looking forward here to the Rose Bowl here in a couple days. And Colin, we'll come back again to you on this one, but and I may know your answer to this. I mean, which phase of this football team do you think carried them throughout the year? Was it a defense, offense, special teams? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. It's just kind of how you view it when you talk about Indiana's 2025 season. Who do you think, which side of the ball for you kind of felt like carried them this year?
Well, I would obviously have to say the defense. I think that they are just so incredible in the way that they carry themselves. And the theme of the Ohio State game was essentially Ohio State could get a chunk play, whether that be 20 or 30 yards. And then the Indiana defense would come right back and punch Ohio State in the mouth with a big play. It seemed like for every single thing that the Buckeyes did right, Indiana had something better and a couple plays later. I mean, it was truly an incredible response, and credit to Bryant Haynes, but I think you have to look to the leaders on the field. Aiden Fisher is a guy that everybody points to, and for good reason. He really is a vocal leader on the field, but he just carries a mentality without even opening his mouth. It just breeds confidence in the defense, and you can just tell that the other guys in the linebacker room carry it, and then the defensive line carries it. And then I really think the secondary has been the most improved unit from the start of the season to the end of the season. Cignetti called them out a couple times early on that the secondary really needs to shape up and get better, and they really have responded. And one stat that it's a little bit nitpicky, but I think it really speaks volumes to this defense is only 2 times throughout the entire season did an opponent have a sustained drive. And by that, I mean there wasn't a play of 40 or more yards, and they didn't start in plus territory. So only 2 times did Indiana allow a touchdown where the opponent started in their territory and they didn't have a big play. And I think that says a lot because the only way to beat this Indiana defense is if you're starting on the 25-yard line or you have a big play. Other than that, chances are you're not ended up with a touchdown, because that's just how impressive they've been in all 3 areas of the defense so far.
Yeah, no question about that. And that's a pretty good aspect to point out about this defense and what they were able to do this year on many fronts. But you just pointed out there a big reason about how stingy they were as a defense as the total year when you look at it from A to Z. Drew, how about you? What side of the ball do you feel carried this ball club this year?
I'm with Colin on the defense there. As good as the offense, Fernando Mendoza and all those guys have been, when you play 13 games and allow 20 points twice, and one of them was because of a pick six, you're going to win a lot of football games doing that. There was another stat that kind of stands out to me. Indiana allowed 12 total touchdowns the entire season on defense in 13 games. They had 25 turnovers forced. So you're almost or more than twice as likely to turn the ball over against Indiana's defense than you are to score a touchdown against them, which is an absurd stat for a big sample. It's 13 games.
Yeah, that is a kind of a unique thing. And again, it's pretty much said throughout college football, defense wins championships. And I don't think there's any question that this defense rose to that occasion this year more than once and kept Indiana in a position to win games. And Zach, I mean, for you, do you feel that is the same overture from you in terms of who carried this ball club for the most of the year?
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with him. I'll throw out the offensive line, though, too, just because of how important the offensive line is to establishing the run game and giving Fernando Mendoza enough time to go win a Heisman. And one thing that stands out to me is when you talk about the defense and just how good it was for Indiana this year, the Joe Moore Award every year in college football recognizes the best offensive line group in the entire country. The three finalists for that award were Iowa, Oregon, and Indiana. So obviously, first off, Indiana's offensive line good enough to be a finalist for that award, but also Indiana dismantled Oregon's offensive line for sure, and was pretty successful enough against Iowa's offensive line too, which just kind of goes to speak and goes to show just how good Indiana's defensive front, the front seven is as a whole. The fact that against that Oregon offensive line that was rated as one of the top 3 units in the country, Indiana had 6 sacks, I believe, against Dante Moore. Not as many sacks against Iowa. That was a little bit of a different game with Gronowski a little bit better of a scrambler for the most part in that game, and Iowa working to get the ball out a little bit quicker. But the fact that Indiana held firm or even dominated, and if you're referencing the Oregon game, 2 of the top 3 offensive lines in the country, and the fact that Indiana was the other of those top 3 offensive lines in the country is pretty telling.
Yeah, no question. And speaking of the Joe Moore Award, and you kind of preferenced something that out of all the awards that Indiana wrapped up this year, and rightfully so, I do think they kind of got, I don't know what the word is, but I do think if you had to give them an award this year, the offensive line should have been that award winner from the standpoint where they were a year ago to where they were this year, including the injuries that they suffered throughout the season that, ended up with them being a team that was 13-0. But, that's kind of just my own personal feeling on that. But when I look at it as well, from either side of the football, I look at it as kind of one of those things that, man, you could also at times throw special teams into the equation too, with a team that was able to get points, I think 11 out of the 13 games right before half. And a lot of that was through field goals and being in a position that you needed those points, because a lot of those times those points really carried him into the second half of ball games, something very seldom I've ever seen before, a team that had that many opportunities and actually came away with points. You just don't see that as much. So again, as much as we like to not single out one side of the ball or the other, yeah, I do think this defense has been the calling card of Coach Cignetti's team for the last 2 years. And rightfully so. If you're going to win a Big Ten championship, you better be good on defense, because you're going to have to be able to stop teams that like to run the ball. And then you're going to face teams, especially with the expansion of the Big Ten, that want to throw the football. And this defense was very good at both in that respect. So much to talk about when it comes to last year or this past season and where Indiana was. But right now, we're getting ready to play one of the greatest bowl games to ever be invented, in my opinion, the Rose Bowl. It's always been that pinnacle game on January 1 that most of the country is always going to be tuning into, a place that Indiana has not gotten to very much. This is only second trip out for this Indiana team. And now they're going to face probably one of the top blue bloods of college football, the Alabama Crimson Tide, that has kind of been the calling card for the SEC for the last decade or so because of Nick Saban and, of course, the teams that they've had. You know, looking at this overall for right now, where do you think are some concerns for you, Drew, with this Indiana team going up against this Alabama team?
Yeah, I think I guess my biggest concern going into the game, you look at Alabama's offense, it's very one dimensional. They've struggled to run the football all year long, and Indiana's run defense, like Indiana should have little trouble stopping their run game. But Indiana, Bryant Haynes, they like to dial up a lot of zone coverage on the back end, and that's kind of been where Ty Simpson has succeeded quite a bit this year, especially with the whole shots down the sidelines, and that's kind of been one of his the big throws he's made. A lot of them have been down the sideline against zone coverage. So it's how does Indiana, getting pressures, I think, going to be the big key for them. We talk so much about the simulated pressures and loading up on one side and then sending someone on the other, trying to confuse the offensive line and quarterback. But if Ty Simpson, if Indiana is unable to get pressure, it could be problematic, especially with the amount of zone Indiana likes to play.
Zach, how about you? What kind of concerns do you have looking at this from the 30,000 feet level at this point in time with this Alabama team facing Indiana?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern, if you're Indiana, the perspective of, you can't probably afford those same mistakes that you saw in that Oregon game, that pick six. It's something that Alabama does very well. They create turnovers. They're, for the most part, timely turnovers. And as we saw against Oklahoma, they can go for touchdowns on the other end of the field and flip the momentum of games very, very quickly. So I think if you're Indiana, if you're Fernando Mendoza, you still have to be able to take those downfield shots. You still have to be able to do like that early shot against Ohio State where Mendoza threw it down the field to Omar Cooper. Cooper obviously got hurt on the play, but you still have to be able to show that you're willing to try and take the top of the defense. But if there's an area on the field, if you go position by position where I think Alabama might be the closest to Indiana, I'd say it's probably in the secondary. Alabama's secondary is good. They've got an All-American at safety. Xavier Brown is one of the best at creating and forcing turnovers and turning those turnovers into pick sixes. He's done that throughout the year. I think that secondary, it's not going to stop Indiana, but I think if there was a point of emphasis, Fernando Mendoza, a little bit more so than usual, he does have to probably take care of the ball more so, and that's probably a little bit more of a point of emphasis than it typically would for a Heisman winner who's done nothing but be brilliant for Indiana all season long. But if you're Indiana, how much would a pick six late in the fourth quarter like you threw against Oregon, could you come back from it again? The odds are not in your favor that you'd be able to come back from that for the second time in the same season.
Yeah, well, this Alabama defense has 11 interceptions on the year, only giving up 168 yards a game passing and 13 touchdown passes on the year. Looking at it flip side, Indiana's defense, they've got 17 interceptions on the year, giving up about 180 yards passing, but only 7 touchdown passes. So you can see both defenses are really capable in the back end of defending the pass and have done pretty well all year long. Colin, how about you? What is a concern for you just looking at it from the black and white of it?
I would say a lack of a passing game, like you guys have said. And looking at the weather forecast, it looks a little dicey. Now, they might say it never rains in Southern California, but it's looking like it might. Um, we obviously don't know the severity of that kind of thing, but we saw in the Purdue game when it was inclement weather, when it was cold, and it obviously won't be as cold as it was at Purdue, but inclement weather nonetheless. Fernando Mendoza did not play well at all. It was his worst game by a million miles, and luckily Indiana was playing Purdue that day because all they needed to do was hand the ball off, and their offensive line did the rest. And they will not have that same luxury against Alabama. If they cannot pass the ball, the running game is going to suffer. If Alabama can stack the box and defend the run and focus on the run, Indiana's going to have a tough go of it. And I've told a couple people already who have asked me, I think the only way Alabama can win this game is if it's really low scoring. I think that, If it's 14-10, I think that's kind of the only score that Alabama could really win by. And the only way that that's possible is if the passing game really isn't working for Indiana. And that could mean from pressure they get on Mendoza, or Mendoza just not really getting a feel for it, and rain and making the ball a little wet could certainly play a factor in that. And so I think that there are a little bit causes for concern looking at the weather and looking at Alabama's defense, because it really is impressive, littered with 4- and 5-star athletes. But you also have to realize that it really will take kind of a perfect storm, no pun intended there, for Indiana to lose this game, because they are the better team top to bottom, and they've proven that this season.
Right now, Alabama's defense is giving up 121 yards on the ground rushing on the year. Indiana's defense, of course, is only given up like 77 yards on the ground. IU, on the other hand, rushing this year, which has been a big staple of this offense, 221 yards, with Black and Hemby doing most of the work. And then, of course, throwing the football, Indiana has thrown for an average of 251 yards on the year, 38 touchdowns, then only 7 interceptions. So, again, in the black and white of it, you'd say a distinctive advantage towards Indiana. But again, I think we all know that Kane Womack, who was the coach here at Indiana, was a defensive coordinator, is a really good defensive coordinator. He does a great job of scheming the opponent. And was able to right the ship after being down 17-zip against Oklahoma and come back and they won that game. So, again, defensive challenge, be a challenge for this offense, very similar in my mindset to what they faced against Ohio State. I think you could split hairs in saying which defense is better to a degree. But I would say very similar in that respects, in that regard. What matchups are you guys are interested to see in this game against Alabama? Whether it's a player specific or a unit specific matchup of this ball game. Zach, what are you intrigued in from that standpoint?
Yeah, I think the Alabama secondary and those cornerbacks against Indiana's receivers with Elijah Surratt, a healthy Omar Cooper, Charlie Becker, and EJ Williams as well. I think that's one to watch. But also, I'm really curious about the battle in the trenches. If you look at Alabama's offensive line, it's good, it's not elite. But one guy that is elite on that offensive front is Caden Proctor. He's projected to be a first-round pick in the upcoming NFL draft. He's one of the better offensive linemen in the country. And I think whichever defensive end he gets matched up against, whether it's Mikhail Kamara, he shifts over to that side of the formation, or whether it's Daniel Ndukwe that gets the step up after Stephen Daly's injury. I think Indiana's going to have to find a way to still manage to get production despite Proctor being a stalwart in both the passing and run game. I'm curious to see what that matchup will look like. It'll be Proctor versus whether it's Mikhail Kamara, whether Indiana decides to slide Mario Landino out to the field side defensive end, or whether it's Daniel Ndukwe and Indiana just goes next man up. I think along with the secondary of Alabama versus the receiving core of Indiana, I'm curious to see Proctor versus Indiana's pass rushers.
Yeah, it's another good point there as well. And, when I look at it from a coaching perspective, I always go to the interior of the offense and defensive lines. And again, I'm interested to see how Indiana's offense, now that they are fully healed, according to Coach Shannon, that they've got everybody back in the swing of things, how they really match up against this Alabama front four, because they're a very, very good front four. And again, we can say that the 4 and 5 stars are heavily favored on the Alabama side of the field in this ball game. That's just a fact, but it'll be an interesting dynamic in the trenches come Thursday, if this rain is coming into the Rose Bowl. And it'd be so ironic that after all these years of sunny weather at the Rose Bowl, Indiana goes the one time that it rains. But Colin, how about you? Is there any matchup that you're key on for this ball game?
Well, unfortunately, Zach stole
okay,
mine that I was thinking of, but I do think that it will be very telling of how Indiana decides to fill the void left by Stephen Daly. Kurt Cignetti was asked 2 different times on his presser on Monday and would not reveal what they were doing. And not that anyone would necessarily expect him to reveal a game plan, but he really didn't say much of anything at all. And so that tells me that they're probably scheming up something a little abnormal potentially. And we talked to Bryant Haynes today, and he was also asked about, would it be next man up with Daniel Ndukwe? Would it be kind of a shift of different things and different schemes? And he basically said, well, we're looking at different options. It's always next man up as our mentality, but he wouldn't commit to saying that it necessarily would be with Ndukwe just simply filling Daly's role. And with an Alabama offensive line that isn't necessarily as good as it's been in the past, you do still have a first round pick in the NFL draft projected in Proctor. And so you have a left tackle that, could potentially lock down whoever is matched up with him. And that really kind of affects the entire line when your left tackle is locking down the edge rusher. It helps the interior offensive lineman, and it kind of just halts any sort of pressure that the defense is bringing on the quarterback. That's why left tackles make the most out of any position other than quarterback historically in the National Football League. And so I do think that, you can't necessarily look at it like that one matchup will dictate everything that Indiana's defense tries to do. But when you look at what they've done so far, it really all starts with quarterback pressure. And if Indiana doesn't get the quarterback pressure that it's gotten against Oregon and against Ohio State, where they almost had the same amount of sacks in that one game than Oregon and Ohio State gave up the rest of the entire season, it could really not be a good situation for Indiana's defense, because if they're not getting pressure, Alabama could move the ball down the field with a talented quarterback. And so that's really the matchup that I point to. Obviously, all are important, but that one is really the one I'm circling.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see whether they go with Ndukwe at the end or flip Kamara back to his natural spot and do something differently to the field inside of the field. But I know that Bryant was a little bit non-committal about that. Daniel would step right in, and the words he used. But again, I think most of these coaches are going to hold things pretty close to the vest because they don't want to tip off anything for the opposing team. And hey, let's face facts. Losing Kellen Wyatt like Indiana did, and then, of course, losing Stephen Daly on the most freakish of injuries I've ever seen. Let's face facts. It hurts. It hurts because the productivity aspect of things. And Daly had been one of the most productive guys all year long, but really in the second half for Indiana in that respect. But let's move on as we get to this game on Thursday. For you, Drew, what do you think Indiana must do in this ball game to have success?
I think they got to play a clean game. Zach brought it up. You can't shoot yourselves in the foot. A fourth quarter pick six against Oregon. That's, as good as Oregon is, winning on the road there, despite that, was really tough. And Indiana outplayed them the entire game. Alabama is going to be really tough. You give, Kane Womack, Kalen DeBoer, like those guys, this much time to prepare. It's, they're going to have something ready. And we saw against Oklahoma, Oklahoma kind of shot themselves in the foot. They went up 17-0 and then kind of gave it away. We haven't really seen Indiana, giving free points remote. Like, it's happened rarely this season. And if Indiana can play a clean football game, I like their chances, especially, the weather forecast. I would kind of disagree with Colin on that. I think that, might be an advantage for Indiana because of their ability to run the football. And I think, they're going to rely on it a lot more. I don't think this is a game we see Fernando, Mendoza dropping back 30 plus times to throw. I think it's, lead on the run game and play through that in the play action.
Yeah, I do think, well, for Indiana and in some respects, Alabama, playing in the rain or a wet surface may not be something that totally affects these two ball clubs just because the way they're built in some respects. Now, Alabama has struggled to run the football this year. There's no doubt about that. And it's kind of surprising to a certain degree that they've struggled that much. But again, I do think both teams are a little bit more acclimated to playing these type of conditions, if that is what entails, especially Indiana playing in the Midwest where the weather changes on the dime. They can play in about any weather in that respect, and they did so at Oregon in that early in the year. For Zach, how about for you in this game? What must Indiana do to find success?
Yeah, I agree with Drew. It's about limiting mistakes, but I also think you have to put pressure on Ty Simpson. He's a good enough quarterback. He's talented enough. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. He's good enough to pick apart even a good secondary like Indiana has if he's not being pressured. If he's able to drop back 30, 40 times, that's what Alabama's done so far. They've been able to still have success offensively. They still put up 30 plus points against Oklahoma while pretty much not having a run game. So being able to be multidimensional, that hasn't been an issue for Alabama. They've been able to be one dimensional in the offensive side of the ball. They've been able to drop back and have Ty Simpson throw 30, 35, 40 times a game and still win games and still have success. So I think you really have to put pressure on Simpson. He will make a mistake. He's not perfect. He's not a guy that's going to go out there and throw 80% passes completed for 400 yards. If he does that, you tip your cap and Alabama probably wins that game at that point. But you have to be able to put pressure on Simpson. You have to force him outside of the pocket. You have to force him to make a slight hesitation. We saw it in the first half. Oklahoma's defensive line was able to get to Simpson and force him really into some uncharacteristic mistakes and force him into a lot of incompletions. And that's why Oklahoma was able to build out that big lead. But I also think Indiana's going to have a killer instinct. We've seen it this year in the come from behind wins against Penn State, against Iowa, and that then against Oregon, and then against the lesser competition, the Big Ten too. Indiana was able to put those teams away relatively early and have that killer instinct. This is a team in Alabama that is very resilient. We saw it obviously against Oklahoma. There's also not many teams in the country that would have come back from a loss in week one to a really bad Florida State team and still managed to make the college football playoff. And that's exactly what this Alabama team has done. They're a very resilient bunch. They'll take 2, 3, 4 punches and still fight back and still manage to keep the game close. So if you're Indiana, it's not going to be one knockout punch that wins you this game. It's going to be a jab there, a jab here and there, 2 or 3 punches that really hammer home and really pull out a victory for Indiana. It's going to have to be more than just one kind of knockout punch for the Hoosiers. They've got to be able to keep that foot on the gas pedal throughout the entire game.
Yeah, no question about that as well. And Colin, how about for you in this respect? Is there, what are the must things for IU in this ball game?
I think they have to control the possession and control the tempo. We could talk about how they need to have pressure and they need to have a balanced running attack and all those different types of things. But, Alabama is a team that has talent, and they had a stretch where they won 5 ranked games in a row. But they're not that same team anymore. And we saw in the Oklahoma game that when Oklahoma got up 17-0, it looked like it was over. But what Oklahoma failed to do is really control the momentum and control the tempo, and they let their 17-0 lead slip away because they made mistakes. And kind of controlling the game also ties into you have to play a clean game. You have to not turn the ball over, and you kind of just have to, be in control and kind of establish your will, so to speak, on the other team. And whether that is with the run or the pass, it really could be both, because the RPO offense that Mike Shanahan installs requires both to be working at a high level for the offense to be firing on all cylinders, right? Obviously, Indiana could run the ball 30 times if the weather is poor, and that would be a smart decision there. But if the weather does clear up, you do want to see Mendoza throw it down the field. And so I think Indiana really isn't honing in on one aspect of the game. I think they're just trying to control it and kind of install what they want to. Bryant Haynes said today that Mike Shanahan's offense is incredible at disrupting what the defense wants to do and kind of get them on their heels, and that's where they do their damage. And I think that's exactly what Indiana needs to do. They need to get Alabama on its heels, and they need to keep it there, because Oklahoma failed to do so, and we did see how fast it can go south if Indiana stops controlling the action.
Yeah, no question in that respect as well. And, I think you hit upon one thing there. And really, Indiana hasn't done this as much in this latter half of the season. And it may be more so out of what defenses are doing to them. But I do think they have to find ways to have the RPO system involved in a game like this. Now, sometimes that's predicated by what the defense is giving you in a lot of respects. And I know Indiana, may be facing some situations where it's just not a good option for them to employ. And I don't know whether they're actually calling it, and it's just because he's handing it off more. I don't know. But I do think RPOs keep a defense off balance. And I think that's something that I hope Indiana can get back to with it. In the Ohio State game, what I thought Indiana did really good was they did a great job of trying to attack and run the football with different elements of the run game. And what I mean by that is not just all inside zone concepts. They ran counter, they ran power, they did a lot of different things in that respects. And it's been a really good thing for them this season with that being said. So we'll see what all happens there, but I agree with you guys on all that about what it must happen for Indiana in this game to have success and all that. Turning to some of the keys to a game like this, I always, when I do my game breakdowns, I kind of put up kind of a idea of what an offense and defense and special teams goal should be going into this ball game. For you, Zach, what do you think are some of the keys to this game for Indiana when you look at it from an OD and special teams in terms of, what does this offense need to do against Bama's defense, Indiana's defense against their offense, so forth and so on? If you had a chance to provide those goals to them in a team environment, what do you see the keys to this game being in that aspect of it?
Yeah, I think obviously you'll get the obvious out of the way. Special teams, just no mistakes. You can't have any of the muff punts or any of the fumbled snaps like we saw Oklahoma have against Alabama. First and foremost, put that on the table. Indiana, you can't have that. Alabama's too good. We'll capitalize on that. You can't have those special teams mistakes. You have to play at least level on that playing field. Offensively, it's all about keeping Fernando Mendoza upright. Let's take a look. Let's think back to Indiana's season as a whole. When has that offense struggled the most this year? You think back to probably on the road against Iowa and that Penn State game as well. The commonality, the common theme in those games that Iowa's defense and Penn State's defense were able to do is put pressure on Fernando Mendoza, make him uncomfortable. Now, yes, Fernando Mendoza ended up winning both of those games on blitzes that the other team sent. That's besides the point. Mendoza had two of his worst performances of the year against Iowa and against Penn State because of the amount of pressure both teams were able to put on him. So you've got to protect Mendoza. That's the number one goal offensively. He is your Heisman candidate. Give him enough time to show why he won the Heisman Trophy and is the best quarterback in the history of the program. That's the offensive goal. Defensively, it's the opposite. You got to force a turnover. You've got to make things happen. You've got to wreak havoc and create havoc, whether that's in the run game, forcing tackles for loss, which Indiana's so good at, whether that's getting to Ty Simpson, and maybe not even getting a sack, but just forcing him outside the pocket, forcing him into an uncomfortable situation because that carries over. That snowballs a little bit. If Ty Simpson, the first 3 plays he drops back to pass, if he's pressured, the next series that he comes out, he's going to start to run that internal clock a little bit quicker, and that's going to be a snowball effect. So I think you've got to really put pressure and create havoc on the defensive side of the ball. And again, it goes back. You've got to have a killer instinct. If you're Indiana, you've got to play clean. I think those are the keys to victory.
All right, Colin, how about you, my man? Where do you think some of the keys to this Indiana's victory in terms of offense, defense, and special teams lie?
We mentioned a lot of it already, and I will say, first and foremost, it does have to be a mistake-free game. Obviously, Indiana could throw an interception, have a fumble, that kind of thing, and still win. But not having an error like that drastically increases their chances because, when you look at a team like Alabama, who is trying to pull off an upset, Indiana's favored by a touchdown or more, depending on where you look. you're going to need to create some mistakes and create some havoc in order to do so, right? And Indiana's the more talented team based on performances this season. Obviously, not more talented in terms of recruiting rankings or anything like that, but that obviously doesn't matter when the two teams will take the field in Pasadena. And I do think the defensive line does need to get some sort of pressure, but I do think that Indiana shouldn't put all its eggs in one basket in terms of trying to get after Ty Simpson. I think that a couple times this season, Indiana has overcompensated and really tried to get after the quarterback, and that's led to a few defensive breakdowns in the middle of the field and in the secondary. Literally, the first play from scrimmage for this team this season was a missed assignment in the middle of the field by a linebacker that went for a 75-yard run. Obviously, that is a long time ago, but it's still things that if Alabama does that, it could really go sideways for Indiana. And so I think that they have to stay within themselves on the defensive end. And if that involves dropping an extra safety, if that involves keeping a couple guys in the middle of the field as sort of a quarterback spy sort of thing, then so be it. I would err on the side of caution, because as the team who is the favorite and has the better defense, I would say you really can't allow big plays, because big plays and mistakes are the two things where Alabama can really get some points on the board quick. And that's what we saw against Oklahoma. Alabama's pick six really turned the tide. And whether that be a pick six this time or, a 50-yard touchdown that Indiana's defense could possibly give up, those could be the things that, loses Indiana a game like this. And then on the
Okay.
offensive side of the ball, I would say just making sure that you have a competent, run game. If that doesn't happen, then it can't all rest on Fernando Mendoza's shoulders. I mean, he'd be the first one to admit it. He's a great quarterback, but he can't do it all. It's a team game, and Indiana's been so great because everybody has played their role and allowed Fernando Mendoza to be elevated in that way. It seems odd to say, but only a couple times this season has he really taken over a game. We look at the Penn State drive, and then we look at, the Oregon drive and things like that. But against Penn State, Omar Cooper made a superhuman catch. If he doesn't do that, then Indiana might lose that game. It obviously wasn't all Fernando Mendoza this season. And so the supporting cast is just as important as their Heisman winner. And with the competent running game, the defense, has to compensate for that. And then Fernando Mendoza can really get to work on those RPOs that we've talked about.
Okay. Drew, how about you? What are some things do you think are, keys to this ball game?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same on both sides. It's protecting the quarterbacks. I think, for Indiana and protecting Fernando Mendoza, Alabama, the D line is starting to get healthy. I believe LT Overton is going to be back for the first time since the South Carolina game. He was out versus Georgia and versus Oklahoma, former 5-star guy, one of their best pass rushers. So protecting Mendoza, giving him the time, we've seen that he can take the hits, he can make the throws while he's getting hit, but he's at his best when he has time to, take a 3-step drop, get through his progressions and get the ball out. And then on the other side, is getting pressure with 4 guys. Indiana, they're going to blitz. They're going to, the simulated pressures, they're going to show 6 guys, come in, send 4. Next play, show 4, send 6, send 5. Bryant Haynes is going to do what he can to confuse Ty Simpson and the Alabama offensive line. We've seen him do it all year. It does not matter who they've played. They're going to throw, the kitchen sink at the quarterback and make him, make decisions, what check he has to make at the line. And it's getting pressure with 4, though. Indiana, they're going to blitz. It's going to happen. But if you can get pressure with 4 and, they're able to drop 7 in coverage, it's going to be really tough for Ty Simpson in that pass game, to really move the football.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that aspect of it and kind of what all you guys have said in it. And, if I had to attach a number to some of these aspects of things, I look at Indiana's run game and, while Alabama's given up 120, I do think Indiana has to run the football for about 200 yards in this game because they have to have the ability to keep Alabama off balance. If Alabama can hone in and they can force Indiana into being one-dimensional and then be able to bring pressure, it's going to be very hard for Indiana to move the football. On the flip side of it, one of the things that I think is going to be important too in this ball game is field position. Indiana's done a great job all year of forcing opponent offense to have to drive on the entire length of the field. very seldom, and I think one of you pointed out earlier, has an opponent taken over the ball inside the 50-yard line against Indiana. That makes it very difficult for offenses to be efficient. Statistics shows the further they have to go to drive to score, it becomes less likely because the percentages are against them. And then, of course, we talked about a little bit is explosive plays. Indiana has done great all year of getting the explosives, especially like against Ohio State, at the same time eliminating explosives against the defense, something that they had problems with that first couple games of the year. That is also a key component of this game. It should be a great game. There's no question about it. I think Indiana's a 6.5-point favorite. We know that Alabama is probably quietly optimistic in this regard, feeling very confident and comfortable playing Indiana as the SEC. And it's a monumental game. And from the standpoint of the chatter, we always hear about the SEC being better than, or any team in the SEC could beat Indiana, and all these things that are on the outside, that I guess the noise aspect of it that fans like to throw around on the x.com a lot, as we see throughout the last few weeks in this. Before we go here, let's take a quick look at what we're going to look at in terms of this transfer portal. Very unique. One time this year, for January 2nd through the 14th, although teams that are in the bowl games and the college football playoffs, I think, get an additional 5 days, if I'm not mistaken, with it, but it's a short window. I guess the biggest thing, does Indiana take a quarterback in the portal this year or not? Drew, we'll start with you. Does Indiana take a quarterback, yes or no?
Yes, I think they might take two, if I'm being honest. I think when you look at it, it's probably an upperclassman. Signetti, I think he likes what he has in Alberto Mendoza. We don't really know what's going on with Tyler Cherry regarding his, knee injury. But I look at a guy like Sam Levitt, Josh Hoover, those guys, like someone like that, an experienced upperclassman who probably has 1 year of eligibility left, and then maybe a guy like Grant Graham, someone who, or Grant Wilson, different IU quarterback, but like an older guy, some experience in the locker room. I'd be shocked if Indiana goes into next year with a redshirt sophomore as the oldest guy in the QB room.
Zach, how about you?
Yeah, I second exactly what Drew said. I think Indiana takes not just one, I think they take two. I think you're looking at a guy that serves a similar role to what Grant Wilson did this past season, and also probably a top-of-the-line starter, a guy that you think can lead you not just to the college football playoff, but a guy that you think can lead you deep into the college football playoff.
How about you there, Colin? Did they take a cue or not?
Well, there's not much more for me to say because these two guys pretty much gave you everything you need to know. I mean,
Okay.
The expectation is that they get at least one and probably two, just because with Alberto Mendoza being your only returning quarterback that has a level of experience, I think that you need two more. And Drew said Josh Hoover. I think that that's kind of the expectation among many Indiana fans. The portal obviously technically isn't open yet, so nothing is confirmed. But I would say if you're an IU fan, look at a lot of Josh Hoover highlights because he might be playing for the Hoosiers next season.
I agree with that. If I had to pick, it's probably Josh Hoover, just because there's been a lot of innuendo along that way. It's interesting to see that the market for a quarterback in the portal is being reported to be $3 to $5 million. And to think that a guy like Dylan Raiola would get top dollar shows you how broken the system, I think, is. Because if he gets $3 million, how much is a guy like, Josh Hoover or Sam Levitt going to be in the portal, or what's that value? It's just a crazy time to think of it. Last question as it pertains to the portal, guys, because if you want to take a quick look at it, I know Zach did a great job of kind of breaking some of this down, but outside of quarterback, what is that one position you think Indiana must get portal guys at in this go around with the portal? We'll start with you, Colin.
It is tough just because you don't really know exactly where the roster is going to be at with guys leaving for the NFL and stuff. So like Omar Cooper is an example. He could leave for the NFL. He could, very well stay. And then Indiana's wide receiver room isn't as thin as it could be. I would say the lines, right? Like you saw how important they were this year. And you have a couple guys on the offensive line departing. Carter Smith likely to go to the draft. Pat Coogan has expiring eligibility, and Khalil Benson also expiring eligibility. And so you have a couple spots to fill on that offensive line, and I think that Indiana is going to want to go get experienced guys who have played either Power Four football or several seasons of Group of Five football and have had results. With Cignetti and his recruiting style, it's results over potential, production over potential. So I think that the offensive line is going to be a big position of need, and then on the defensive line, same thing. You have a lot of guys who are seniors and who are going to be leaving. You also have guys who could return, like Mario Landino, and so I think that you're not losing everything, but you can never really have too many guys on the line, especially with injuries like we've seen this year. You want to have depth. You want to have a lot of guys who are experienced. And so I think that that's kind of what they're going to go after. But, they're going to go after anything they can get in the portal. If Cignetti thinks that they'd be a good fit for the program and can produce, then they're going to go after him.
Offensive line wise, could be having to replace 4 out of the 5 starters on this offensive line, especially if Carter Smith announces that he's going to the NFL. Drew, how about you? What one position do you see of being that high priority for this Indiana team for the portal?
I think it's corner. This is assuming D'Angelo Pons goes to the NFL draft, which kind of seems likely at this point. Is Shamari Sharp, is he ready to be, the number one lockdown guy? Part of what makes this defense so special with Brian Haynes is they know D'Angelo Pons has that side of the field covered, and they can do a lot of stuff on the other side and mix and match. But knowing he's able to, take away, for the most part, a lot of teams' number one receiver, it's a huge weapon. And look at the corner depth with who is someone that can step up and be that guy and the number one lockdown corner in this team. And I think Cignetti, recognizes what Pons does for the defense. I know Brian Haynes for sure does. So I think they'll look to add someone at corner for sure.
Yeah, and we don't know what the guy like Gandy and Knighton, the 2 kids that were transfer portal last year, one from Pittsburgh, one from Northern Illinois, who were in backup roles, do they stay? And if they do stay, then I do think they're pretty settled in some of those areas, but that's the big $64,000 question. Zach, last one for you there. What is that portal need you think's the most important for Indiana?
Yeah, I agree with both Drew and Colin. I think Drew hit the nail on the head with cornerback. I think I'd label that as the 3rd most important position right now. I think I'd go offensive line as number 1. We've seen the importance of an offensive line. Colin said it earlier. That was really the biggest difference in the trenches from last year to this year for Indiana, being able to stand up to some of these blue bloods and some of these blue bloods defensive line. So I think offensive line are going to have to probably replace Carter Smith. I think you bring Drew Evans and Bray Lynch back at guards. Azani probably in there at somewhere in the offensive line, probably on the interior somewhere. But you're going to have to replace some tackles, especially. So I think that is a big key for Indiana, especially that blindside blocker, assuming Indiana brings in a right-handed quarterback. But definitely want to bring in a left tackle, somebody to protect that quarterback blind side. And then defensively, specifically at defensive end, Mikala Kamara's gone. Kellen Wyatt's gone. Stephen Daly is not back next year either. So I think you like what you have on the interior of the defensive line with Tyreek Tucker and Mario Landino. But we all know the importance at every level of football that a stud, superstar, elite defensive end makes. Their game records. They can create havoc and win you games nearly by themselves sometimes if they're that good at the defensive end spot. So I think that'll be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, kind of priorities for Indiana at defensive end.
Well, there's no question that the front office staff and the recruiting department is putting in long hours right now because of trying to make sure they cover their bases with the portal needs and the fact that this team is playing for a national championship, which is 3 games away after this game with Alabama. Guys, I appreciate you doing this and getting a feel for this game against the Alabama Crimson Tide. It should be a dandy. I'm not going to ask for your score predictions. They'll have to read that and the winner of the Alabama Indiana game on thehoosier.com. When Zach puts that out this in the next day or so on the website, get over there today. Get your subscription. You can get all the details of not just this game, as well as the basketball team's journey into the Big Ten season right now, as well as the coverage of the bowl and recruiting, all on thehoosier.com. For Zach, Colin, and Drew, I'm the coach, Shannon Griffith. We'll see you next time here on the Hoosier Tailgate on thehoosier.com.